In 1922, violent racial protests rampaged through the city of New York as Asian Americans fought against the passing of the Manchester Act. This act was a major event throughout The Chosen and the Beautiful by Ning Vo and was often talked about by the rich white socialites. But what was it exactly? Now, before we talk about it, let's talk about some background information. Asians have been immigrating to America since the 1750s, but they mostly began to arrive in the US in the 1800s and 1900s in hopes of finding a better life and seeking this so called American dream life. Some ran from their war stricken countries in poverty with the promise of jobs and mining gold. But of course, America was nothing like they had imagined, and instead they were oppressed and discriminated against by the white society. They were given minimum wage jobs and the most difficult jobs with no benefits. Yet they worked hard to make a living and provide the best they could for their families. So, despite all the racism and discrimination, Asians made a home in the streets of America called Chinatown, a taste of home with familiar restaurants, languages, and their rich cultures. This is also where Jordan Baker, the main character in the novel, went to connect with her Vietnamese roots because she had been adopted as a baby and raised in a rich white family. And that was when Jordan realized how isolated she had become from her culture because of her privileged white upbringing and education, how the class differences and environment really created this big gap between herself and the culture. Now that we've talked about background information, let's actually talk about the Manchester Act. So this bill was created to rid America of all Asian immigrants because they were taking all the white people's jobs. There were simply too many of them, and their culture was just growing in the country. Naturally, this upset the white people because how dare the Asians make a living for themselves and make the most out of living in America. So, of course, all the rich and powerful people, white people in society, pushed for this act to be passed, calling the Asians no better than demons, Vo, page 132, and that they had become too bold with wanting equal rights after being given the ability to vote. And of course, in the novel, this act was actually passed, and a lot of Asians actually began to start fleeing the country. But now that we talked about the Manchester Act, we need to realize that this act was actually not real in American history, but it is a parallel to various laws and acts implemented throughout history to oppress and discriminate against Asian Americans. For example, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and of course, self-explanatory, this just excluded Chinese people from entering America. But most importantly, this Manchester Act was a major parallel to the existent Immigration Act of 1924. And in summary, this act was passed in America so that they could create a sense of homogeneity in the country of purely white Americans. And they reduced their immigration quota to around 3% of their population. And to further restrict immigrants, as part of an act in 1917, there was a literacy test. So anyone over the age of 16 had to prove that they had basic comprehension of the language and reading it, which was extremely unfair to newcomers who had no understanding of the language at all. But this was just a way for officials to further discriminate and decide who they can exclude, and just gave more power and flexibility to officials. Now, here is a picture of President Coolidge, the 30th President of the US, signing the passing of the Immigration Act. And here is a newspaper clipping. So originally, with the acts in place, for example, the Chinese Exclusion Act, it only excluded the Chinese and previously exempted the Japanese. But with the 1924 Act, it included the Japanese, and this infuriated Japan, and tension rose between the two countries. However, Congress found that preserving this racial composition of pure white Americans was more important than a good relationship with Japan. And basically, this 1924 act covered from the Middle East to Southeast of Asia and was considered the Aztec barred zone. So if you were in that zone, you could not enter the country. And here, from a statement from Congress, Asians were then degraded furthermore to being aliens and dehumanized so drastically because of their physical differences compared to their pure white Americans. And this was further used to spread the kind of lie that they were not the same and Asians did not deserve to be in the country of America. And here is kind of a comic depicting the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. It's like a parody of the Great Wall of China, but now it's restricting Chinese people from entering the country of America. But finally, this act was revised in 1952 and then officially changed to the Immigration and Nationality Act in 1965, which now gave priority to relatives and children of U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents, professionals, anyone with special skills, or refugees. And basically, if you wanted to work in America, you can now apply, and race was not a big factor anymore. So, America's long racist history is no news to anybody, and they continue to be on the news to this day for hate crimes against people of color and minorities happening in their country. Asians in America fear for their lives with the rise of anti Asian hate crimes due to the COVID-19 pandemic, as innocent people are being and killed for simply being Asian. So, although America demolished some racist laws and ideals, the bare minimum, mind you, they still have a long way to go in protecting minorities and owning up to their long racist history. But that's a lesson for another time. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you learned something today.